Welcome to the second event in our Reading and Action series inspired by the recently published volume, Contingent Faculty and the Remaking of Higher Education, a Labor History, edited by Eric Feuer-Slocum and Claire Goldstein. I'm so glad all of you can join us here this evening. This important book offers us a valuable resource for understanding, first, how and why faculty contingency and precarity have grown so dramatically over the past generation or more, as well as two, what the effects have been of this contingent faculty system for those who labor and learn inside it, as well as for the higher ed system as a whole. And third, what is being done today and what needs to be done to remake this higher ed system, not from the top down, but from the bottom up in the interest of faculty, students, and the broader communities we serve. A word about me, I'm Joe Ramsey, and I'll be facilitating our agenda this evening, which was posted in the chat box just a moment ago. I am a full-time, non-tenure track faculty in English and American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where for over a decade I've been an activist and a representative in my union local, the Faculty Staff Union, which is in the Massachusetts Teachers Association, the MTA. I'm also chair of the Contingency Task Force, CTF for short, of HELU, that's Higher Ed Labor United, one of the co-sponsors for tonight's event. The Contingency Task Force of HELU is tasked with centering the voices of contingent faculty and the concerns about labor contingency within HELU's broader mission of building a wall-to-wall and coast-to-coast higher ed labor movement, one that can unite faculty across ranks alongside other campus workers, students, and the communities we serve in a struggle to take back higher ed for the common good. You'll hear a bit more from me later in the program after our panel of speakers. Tonight's event, I want to add, is co-sponsored by HELU, Higher Ed Labor United, and HELU's Contingency Task Force, and by the Center for the Study of Academic Labor, as well as the Joint Committee of the Labor and Working Class History Association, that's LAUCHA, the committee is focused on contingent and community college faculty and independent scholars. I believe it is called CFIS for short. Thank you to all of you who put so much work to make this two-part series happen. Before turning things over to Eric and Claire, our co-editors, a few words about the plan for tonight's event. At our first event last month, we heard from 3 of the essay contributors to the new book, followed by open breakout room conversations, followed by report backs to the full group. The video from that first event, as well as the notes from those breakout groups, will be shared in the chat box. And if you would like to receive them directly, you can make a note in the chat and we'll get them to you. Tonight, we update the basic format from last month with a panel featuring 2 book contributors, really 3. We have Maria Maisto, Claire Raymond, and then 2 reader organizer respondents, one of whom is also a co-contributor to the volume. That'll be Helena Worthen and myself, Joe Ramsey. We will then once again head into breakout rooms, this time themed rooms. You can choose your room when the time comes, followed by report backs and another round of full group discussion. Among our goals is to help folks share and build on key insights, ideas, and proposals that emerge from our small group discussions. It is the expressed hope of the organizers for tonight's event that the work brought together in this volume and in this event will contribute usefully to urgent conversations, not only tonight, but in the time to come and in other spaces. Conversations that will lead to the kind of strategic and grounded collective organizing that the present situation, some might call it a present crisis, demands. Speaking for HELU, we have all sorts of upcoming events and ways to plug in, including an event on struggles at the community colleges on Saturday, March 23rd. So don't hesitate to reach out. I will put my email and other links in the chat. And now to introduce our co-editors. They may need no introduction to many of you, but they get an introduction nonetheless. Eric Feuer-Slocum is, of course, co-editor of Contingent Faculty and the Remaking of Higher Education, a Labor History. He has also taught as a long-term contingent faculty member at St. Olaf College. He is the author also of Contesting the Post-War City, Working Class and Growth Politics in 1940s Milwaukee, and co-editor of Civic Labors, Scholar Activism and Working Class Studies. He co-founded the Labor and Working Class History Association's Contingent Faculty Committee and serves on the Organization of American Historians Executive Board. More from Eric in a moment. Claire Goldstein taught as contingent faculty at the University of Maryland, the University of North Florida, and American University. She has published extensively on contingent faculty issues and served on the board of New Faculty Majority Foundation. She is the author, in addition to being the co-editor of the present volume, she is the co-author of The Struggle for America's Promise, Equal Opportunity at the Dawn of Corporate Capital, and is currently working on a book about free speech in the early 20th century United States. Eric and Claire, the Zoom is yours.
Great. Thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone for coming. Eric, our comments are going to be pretty brief, so you have a chance to hear from the contributors more in depth and then move to the discussion in the breakout rooms. But I particularly want to thank all the contributors to the book, especially those who are here. Helena, Maria, Claire Raymond, Steve, and Sue, and Trevor Griffey's on the call. So we'll add him into the mix, even though he has to leave shortly to go teach. And I also just want to echo Joe's thanks to all the co-sponsors for this event. Just in the couple minutes I have, I wanted to just mention a little bit about how the book came about. So Eric and I met through our activism, and we first met as members of the Contingent Faculty Committee for LACHA, the Labor and Working Class History Association, and trying to advocate and move changes through a professional association that we were both a part of. And I think that the idea for the book really came through conversations and combination of our training as labor historians, as well as our own lived work experience as contingent faculty, trying to place our own experience, what was happening to us in some sort of labor history context, to really start thinking about contingent faculty as having a labor history and as part of larger changes that were happening to the worlds of work and the world of labor, and in a context of political economy. The structure of the book, which Joe kind of touched on in his opening remarks, I sort of see it as bookended by two sections that try to provide a larger context and framing. And then in between are these three main sections, which my elevator speech for that is how we got here, what here looks like, how do we get out of here? And I think those are the things that Joe touched on. Each of those sections begins with a short personal narrative that speaks to those respective themes. And the last thing I'll say is just while the book can't cover everything, because no book can be comprehensive despite our best efforts to do that, I think we do try to illustrate through the book a diversity of contingent experiences, and also to try to identify those areas of commonality, but also a diversity of viewpoints. And one of the things I really appreciate about the book is that not all of the authors agree with one another. And hopefully that helps to make for some more robust discussion. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Okay, thanks, Claire. And I'm just going to quickly put in the chat the link to the reading guide, and I'll just say a few words about the reading and discussion guide. But first, I wanted to just second Claire's thanks to everybody who organized this and for everybody who's here. And we're just grateful to be part of this conversation. So one of the things that we've done is put together a reading discussion guide for this book, and it's now housed on the website of the Center for the Study of Academic Labor. And so I especially thank Sue Doe and Steve Schulman for being willing to house this and sponsoring this as well. So the reading and discussion guide is, as you'll see if you open that link, structured very much like the book. We really do follow that structure that Claire just talked about. So there are questions and prompts on the structure and the political economy of higher ed, the making of the contingent faculty majority. And then on experiences of contingency at work in the workplace, and then the actions that contingent faculty and others are taking, especially through organizing and collective action. And then finally, the larger project of reclaiming higher ed's public purpose as well. We really hope that this guide can be a tool for workplace-based reading groups and discussion groups, union-based reading groups, discussion groups. And so we've tried to structure the questions so that they ask readers to reflect on the essays and the various parts of the book, but then really to connect that to people's experiences as well. And so this is a guide that's made to be particularly for an audience of contingent faculty, but also we're hoping that the guide can be there in groups that are also trying to educate tenure stream faculty on these sets of issues and others who are concerned and involved in the prospects and the future of higher education. So we'll have a chance for one of the reading groups or the breakout groups to talk about some of this as well. But hopefully you can turn to that resource and make some use of that. So with that, I'll turn it, I think, back to Joe, who will then introduce the speakers.
That's right. Thank you, Eric and Claire, not only for your great editorial work and your organizing of this event. This is such a remarkable volume, but also I wanted to single you out for your written contributions to the volume as well. I mean, I know that some will say this book must be read cover to cover, and I cannot disagree. But I also say that if you only have time to dip in, or you need a colleague to kind of get a sense of it, the intro and conclusion that Eric and Claire have authored respectively are really phenomenal concentrations of some of the core issues of this volume. And so I just want to thank you both for your work as writers as well as editors. And I think the collective work of scholarly editing doesn't get as much value and valuing as it deserves in our very individualist-oriented culture and academic economy. So just thank you again for the collective work and for your own writing, both. And I think that deserves, little physical movement here, if y'all can put your hands together, even in your mutedness. All right. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple more things, and you're not going to hear from me for a while. You're going to hear from some other people. I'm going to introduce our first two speakers. In fact, I'm going to introduce all the speakers at once. So then we can just get to the speakers. We will be hearing from three book contributors, but two as contributors and one as a kind of a co-respondent. Our first book contributor will be Maria Maisto. Maria Maisto taught English composition as a contingent faculty member for over 15 years in Maryland and Ohio, and has published and spoken widely on the topic of contingent faculty equity, organizing, and coalition building. In 2009, she co-founded New Faculty Majority, the National Coalition for Adjunct and Contingent Equity, a 501c3 membership and advocacy organization, and serves as its president. She has undergraduate and graduate degrees from Georgetown University and Washington, D.C. After Maria, we will have Claire Raymond. Claire Raymond taught as a non-tenure track lecturer at the University of Virginia from 2007 to 2020, now a visiting collaborative researcher at Princeton University and a visiting assistant professor at Bates College. She is the author of 9 books of critical theory, including Photography and Resistance, Anti-Colonialist Photography in the Americas. As Claire Milliken, she is a poet and recipient of the Maine Literary Award. She lives with her family in rural coastal Maine. Helena Worthen, who is a contributor to the volume along with Joe Barry, but will also be a respondent this evening. Helena became active in her union while working as contingent faculty in California. Her book, What Did You Learn at Work Today? The Forbidden Lessons of Labor Education, won the Best Book Award from the United Association for Labor Education, UALE, in 2014. She and Joe Barry co-authored Power Despite Precarity, Strategies for the Contingent Faculty Movement in Higher Education, which came out quite recently, a book I highly recommend. She is also a delegate to Higher Education Labor United from the National Writers Union. A few words about myself as the final respondent. In addition to my work with HELU and the Contingency Task Force, I am a scholar activist who works on the injustices and absurdities of the tiered academic labor system, but also the relationship between 20th and 21st century cultural production, racial capitalism, and struggles for social justice and equality. If you want to look up things I've written, you can look up Joseph G. Ramsey. My essays on academic labor have appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, Inside Higher Ed, New Politics, Salon, and Counterpunch, as well as many a union newsletter. I've also edited 4 book-length essay collections, including the special joint issue of Works and Days and Cultural Logic on the theme of Scholactivism, Reflections on Transforming Praxis in and Beyond the Classroom. I will share that in the chat box. But first, we turn it over to Maria. Thank you for being here, Maria.
No, thank you for having me. I didn't know I was going to be first, but that's okay. Uh, what I wanted to do, because I was asked to reflect on the chapter that I wrote, which was Common Ground for the Common Good, what we mean when we talk about uh, our motto, which is faculty working conditions, our student learning conditions. So when I was thinking about how I would want to reflect on it, I started to think about three overarching themes. Um, Unsurprised, they're not going to be very surprising to this audience: teaching, learning, and relationships. And I really realized that as as I was thinking about it, it's also very much about identity, our identity as academics and our identity as activists, and how we wrestle with and contend with that aspect of our identity. So a little bit just to follow on to the introduction. So when I started working on this chapter, I was in between jobs. I had moved back to DC. NFM was very much in, new faculty majority was very much in limbo, and we had no money. I needed to find a job because I was supporting my family. And I didn't know what I wanted, what I could do. I worked for 1 year outside of higher ed. It was a very interesting sort of community uh, and local politics type of job, but I was very uncomfortable in it. And then a friend of mine said, there's a temporary position at the university. Why don't you take it while you're looking for something else? So I said, okay, why not? I took it. It was very much an entry-level position, and it was very much an exercise in humility for me because I was not teaching. So my identity as a teacher was very much compromised. But I was working with really great people. Then the pandemic hit, and I wasn't going to go anywhere. I was going to look for a job. And then eventually I realized as I was working there that I could move into academic staffing. I had stable employment, I had health insurance, I had access to retirement for the first time in over 20 years. And that was quite enough to help me get over any disappointment that I had, that I was not teaching, and that I was that I was no longer, that I couldn't really, that I wasn't a professor, that I couldn't think of myself as a professor. And I had to deal with people not understanding that I had that background and treating me very much like a low-level academic staffer, which gave me a lot more insight into what academic staffers go through. So that's one thing that I hope that we can talk about. However, I'm happy to say that I am still teaching, because I am teaching young people who are just starting out in the workplace, people that are very close to me as they are in their first jobs. I'm doing a lot of teaching of them, of what they're going through in the workplace. So I'm very happy about that. So this idea of teaching and our identity, that's one idea. The second thing is learning. So part of what I tried to talk about in my chapter is what are we learning from our activism. And one of the things that we as activists have often talked about, it's one thing that I've often talked about with colleagues, is the frustration of feeling like you're reinventing the wheel, and that you're spinning. And those of you who have been in this, doing this work for many, many, many years are familiar with that feeling. But I learned from Joe Barry, who is here, I learned not to get discouraged and frustrated, because everything that you go through is something that can teach you something for the next step. So rather than getting frustrated, oh my God, we're talking about this, we've been talking about what do we call contingent faculty? We've been talking about that for 30 years. That's okay. It's okay to talk about that. Let's just help keep moving the conversation forward. So even though a lot of things get repeated, there's always forward movement. And even if sometimes there's backward movement, either for the individual like me, where I feel like I've stepped back, sometimes that's necessary, and then that's necessary for us to be able to go forward again. And then finally, relationships. So my chapter was really about exploring the relationships of the ideas of higher education and its relationship to the community and to the common good, the relationships of students and faculty, the relationships of work and learning, and the relationship of the conditions of work to the conditions of learning, and trying to understand how power animates all of those relationships and how power shifts. And sometimes you learn from your students, and sometimes you teach your students. Sometimes you learn from work, and sometimes you have to work at learning. So that concept of trying to remember that we have to think about relationships is something that I'm continuing to wrestle with as I try to think about what do I do going forward now that I'm no longer faculty, now that I'm staff. What are my relationships with other staff? What are my relationships with faculty? What are my relationships with the other people who work on campus, which I have to say, I didn't think as much about when I was a faculty member as I should have. And that's really, really important to pay attention to. So those are the sort of three themes, ideas that I wanted to share with you, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation and to learning more from all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria. We'll next hear from Claire Raymond.
I was saying I'm more comfortable talking standing up, but the light is really bad here. So I hope you'll just forgive me for that. And then after I speak, I can sit down and you can see my face again. Is that okay? I mean, I can put my grandmother up. She's like this is my namesake grandmother, very lovely lady, if you want to look at that instead. So there's Grandmother Claire. I mean, a long time ago, obviously. She did live a long life, but not that long. So my comments actually kind of go a little bit off from the chapter that I wrote for Eric and Claire's book, and I hope that's okay. I'm sort of just kind of extending some of those thoughts. And I did want to also say that in the introduction that you gave, Joe, which was so nice, so the position at Princeton and Bates, those were both temporary, and so I do not hold those anymore. So one was from 2020 to 2022, and the other was 2021 to 2023. And it's very typical of my employment history that I've been visiting faculty all years I was at UVA. I was technically called visiting faculty there. So I've just sort of been perpetually visiting for about the past 20 years. Yeah. So anyway, so I'm gonna just read this, and y'all tell me if you can't hear me, just, let me know. So just thinking about the comment at our last meeting about shifting from awefulism to activism, and of course my chapter in Contingent Faculty and the Remaking of Higher Education is a kind of an awefulism chapter. But for another project, I've been reading some Laclau and thinking about this question of the conditions within which terms are spoken. And so I was thinking about these key terms just as words, right? Tenure track, non-tenure track. Not only the conditions those words create, but also from what conditions those words emerge. And so, conditions that tenure track versus non-tenure track create and states a deep divide with value-laden assumptions fanning out on either side. Tenure track connoting respect, scholarly status, power within the system. Non-tenure track connoting powerlessness within the system, and shame, which is really, I wrote about this structure of shame as I called it social dirt in the chapter for Claire and Eric. This evening, I wanted to think about who this structure of social dirt really benefits. It doesn't seem to benefit non-tenure track faculty, who, as we all know, are the majority of faculty in the United States now. It benefits tenure track faculty in the, I think fairly limited sense that they have, right, stable employment, fairly well paid and respected, and the added pleasure, if you want to think of it that way, of always conceiving of themselves as superior to those who don't have tenure track. And that's a fairly new feature of academia, right, which used to be made up of almost entirely tenure track profs. But the most direct beneficiaries of the tenure track, non-tenure track divide are administrators whose bloated salaries and metastasizing presences are hallmarks of the corporatization of academia, their wealth quite literally funded by non-tenure track poverty. And then the greatest beneficiary, and the one that I'm really the most interested in of this divide, is the system of untrammeled capitalism that has found a way to defang one of its key critics, right, the academy, by creating a workforce that is primarily made up of people who are disrespected, poorly treated, inadequately compensated, and above all, people who have great difficulty, I would say, summoning the resources, time, and above all, platform to critique the system of untrammeled capitalism that we obviously live in the United States. And by platform, I mean specifically that the context of being a non-tenure track faculty member places an immediate suspension of sort of disbelief around one's every utterance, and in a public sense, right, if you're publishing something. So I'm going to give a couple examples of this. For years, I've been giving papers at the Feminist Art History Conference at American University, which is a conference that I love. It's very, sort of passionately and unapologetically feminist. And the last iteration of that conference before the pandemic, and a casual conversation with some women who are also regulars of the conference, I mentioned that I'm non-tenure track. That's back when I was at UVA. And, it was like I had said I was a felon. And then you could just see their attention shift away. Like suddenly their high opinion of my work was like, well, this is, this is work by someone that we don't need to think about. And you could really see the shift. And no offense to them. I mean, they're good people as far as that goes. But the other thing I was going to talk about more in terms of this, because obviously what I'm zeroing in on is academic freedom. And so this is a section of my experience at UVA that I haven't talked about as much in this. I think I briefly mention it in the book. But I taught feminist theory frequently there. I taught for 5 different departments and programs, right? So that was how I got my courses. I taught for the English department, the sociology department, art history, media studies, and the gender studies program. So I would often teach a course on feminist theory. And one year I decided to sort of flip the syllabus in the sense of make it very much grounded in African-American, Latinx feminism, and bring in white feminist theory later in the semester. So a sort of flipping of what you would usually have, right? Which would be white feminism, and then you bring in other kinds of feminism. And so this was 2016. And so 2 white women, sort of upper class white women in the class, were quite offended by the syllabus that I was teaching, and distressed by it, and complained to the administration that it was creating a hostile environment for them, which if anyone here knows about feminist theory, hostile environment is a kind of key component of feminist theory. And so anyway, I ended up losing my job with that department, right? Because I had upset those students by teaching this syllabus that, decentered whiteness. And, to be fair, this is the University of Virginia, and Glenn Youngkin is, of course, in control there. He was not in control then, but it's still whatever, it's the same place. But it was quite a traumatizing experience. And the thing that I want to, sort of turn to is, right, the lack of intellectual freedom that was, so clearly expressed in that experience, right? That the idea that I was going to teach this, sort of, and not really all that radical a syllabus. I mean, right, I started with Bell Hooks, who's, extremely well known. And so, I guess a question that one could ask is, what could non-tenure track do to alter this situation? Like what could be a higher education labor union goal? And, I think it was mentioned in the last meeting, equal pay for equal work. That's certainly one path. I also think of the sort of whimsical and non-standard way that the division of tenure track, non-tenure track is meted out. That it really seems to have this kind of clubby feel of like who can be brought in and counted on not to rock the boat. So, and I'll kind of go a little deeper into that if I have time. I think I do have a couple more minutes. Yeah. So anyway, after I was fired by the Department of Sociology, that's who I was teaching for in that. Yeah, I can definitely get it within 2.5 minutes. No worries, John. Yeah, that's who I was teaching the feminist theory syllabus for. I've been publishing poems with a Black-brown woman-led press called Two Leaf Press in New York City. And I was, kind of friends with the woman who runs it. And so I told her what happened, and she said, well, you got to do a book about this. So I gathered some former students who, were, I will just say, not white. And we wrote this book. I mean, it's a really ragtag book. Like, it is not at all like Claire and Eric's beautiful, polished book. But I reached out to Richard Delgado, who was a law professor and is one of the, sort of founding architects of critical race theory. And I asked him to write the conclusion. So I sort of got to know him. And one of the things that I learned from him, and that, he writes about actually in that book, and I'm not suggesting you all should buy that book. I'm not promoting it at all. It's really not that good a book. It's kind of interesting, but is, this theory that he has that the structure of racial capitalism is such that when we say we're addressing it, we're really just moving people from, if you think of a racial caste system, right, that we're just moving people from a racial caste into positions of power within the existing system who can be counted on to, or basically who implicitly agree to perpetuate that system. So Richard Delgado, I don't know if y'all are familiar with him. He's quite an elderly fellow at this point, like in his 80s. And, really sort of ending his career on a very cynical note, right? This sense of like shifting just the sort of window dressing. So to kind of get to my conclusion, I think that, what interests me about this tenure track, non-tenure track divide is just how incredibly useful it is for, again, like making the academy a site that, can give, in some ways, use a lot of progressive wording, but not take progressive action within its own body. And so I do find that very fascinating. And that's, my thought of, again, kind of going from awfulism to activism is to think about, who benefits from this system, which can seem like such a nonsensical system, really, once you look at it closely. And so that's, sort of what I wanted to bring to the table today. So yeah, that'll do. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire and Maria. We're going to move to Helena Worthen, who occupies 2 hats, at least right now. She is a contributor to the volume, but is also now tasked with responding as a respondent. After Helena, I'll offer a few thoughts before taking us into breakout rooms where we can all share our own. Helena, take it away.
Okay. Great. As one of the contributors, I got an early copy of this book and I read it as fast as I could, and I filled the back pages with notes, and I wrote up a 4-page screed because that's basically what I do. And I understood the title of the book, The Remaking of Higher Education, to be a bad thing, because I think right in front of us right now, we are watching the remaking of higher education as it is being pillaged and smashed. So I read the book looking for that and looking for as many places as possible. This is like with a really narrow lens. This is not the way other people necessarily would have read it, but I read it looking for connections between job security, which contingents do not have, and academic freedom, which you can't have without job security, and the public good and democracy. Because I thought that the whole purpose, or, a big purpose of higher education was to produce a thoughtful citizenry who could guide our world through into the survival of climate change. And I think we need this rather urgently right now. So this is how I read the book. And I think you're all going to get sent my 4-page thing on that. But there's a few particular things that I want to point out. One is, if they are pillaging higher education, what is the value that they want, they meaning the people who are remaking higher education right now? What is the value that they want, and what is the value that we want? I think those are questions that we have to be asking ourselves as we read this book and as we get involved in HALU and as we try to reclaim the remaking of higher education. There were two things, and they just happened to overlap with what Claire Raymond just said, and I didn't know she was going to point these two things out. One reason why they are pillaging higher education is on page 117. Actually, I'm going to start with the one on page 91, which is where Sue Doe and Stephen Schulman have a page with two tables down at the bottom. The one at sorry, I'm trying to hurry. The one at the top, table 6.5, is instructional surplus per FTE student. Okay, I believe that means the extra money that is not spent in the classroom is spent for instructional purposes, but that just is out there. And down at the bottom, it says total instructional surplus by institutional type in 2019. And that total comes to $67 billion. So if one of the reasons why they are trying to remake higher education is simply because there's a whole lot of money sitting around, this is a good chapter to read so that you actually get your facts straight. I know that all of us, when we see what the cost of hiring a contingent faculty person to do a job, we all know that the money has got to be going somewhere. But in this chapter, you can actually find out where it's going, and there's some real numbers, and they're worth quoting. The other thing that I wanted to point out and this was actually something that Claire talked about just now, is on page 117, where she says, as Claire, this is her section on social dirt, but she's mentioning Claire Goldstein too. As Claire Goldstein argues in this book, the myth that academia is a meritocracy fuels the shaming of the adjunct who is seen as deserving of her fate. This is, of course, parallel to the larger myth of capitalism as a meritocracy, and indicates the deepening and toxic fusion of academia and no-holds-barred late-stage capitalism. So if we're asking why they are attacking higher education right now, for example, what's going on in Florida, what's going on in Texas, I think there are 23 states that have gag orders of one sort or another, the divisive concept stuff, the elimination of sociology as a elective or requirement. I'm not quite sure which in Florida. If we're asking why that could possibly be going on, it's because higher education is where new knowledge gets produced and then promulgated. It's where the research happens and the publication, and then where all of that gets fed into the student body, who are the population that we want to have alert and awake, to use a difficult word these days. And those things threaten the white supremacy late stage capitalism situation, which then leads me to want to say, it has always been thus. That's what higher education is for, is to create the kind of knowledge that will disturb the powers that be. And it has always done that. It's done it going back to Galileo and going back to Socrates. So, we shouldn't be surprised that that's what's happening. In fact, we should organize around it and intensify it and, do it more. I'm sorry I'm being a little incoherent, but I wanted to get all of those points strung together in some way so that my search in this book for evidence of the link between job security, academic freedom, which is necessary in order for the creation of this new knowledge that is a big shit disturber, and democracy and the public good, I wanted all of those to get linked together and to emphasize that we really shouldn't be surprised if there are $67 billion sitting there that can be squeezed out of higher education. And if higher education is actually something that is bothering those who would like to keep things the way they are, then at least we know what side we're on and we can visualize what it is that we want as compared to what they want.
Oh yeah, I wasn't saying why and all. I was using that as like a rhetorical. I mean, I wasn't literally saying why, if that makes sense in my comments. Yeah.
I loved what you said. That was good.
Okay.
Oh, I think you're all on the same side of this one. Thank you, Helena and Claire and Maria. And I'm going to try to just make a couple short comments here, having read the book, and I'm still really processing and hoping to process in writing and in conversation. Actually, I think we were going to do a print interview with Eric and Claire and myself, and maybe others from the volume. But I'll offer a few thoughts and takeaways from the book, and then maybe I'd like to lead us in a little bit of a collective warm up and brainstorming session in the kind of maybe get us warmed up for the breakout sessions. So the first thought here is that I think what Helena just Helena just spotlighted a few important moments in this book. One is the chapter by Sue Do and Stephen Schulman, who are both on this call, and it points out how contingency is a surplus generating project. And I think it's very important. This takes on something that I think Eric called last time we met last month, the mask of austerity. Right? We talked about, I think Claire, Raymond, and others have, and the other Claire, both the Claires here have talked about the need to take on the myth of meritocracy. And I believe Eric said we need to also kind of take off the mask, or force the removal of the mask of austerity, because underneath the austerity claims and the so-called necessity of austerity in light of so-called scarcity, we actually have contingency fueling surplus generation, not just for capitalism as a whole, but literally on our campuses. And so I want to kind of accent what Helen already pointed us to, and also to point out that Sue and Stephen will be leading one of the breakout sessions that will start in just a few minutes. I believe it is the session called, I'm not looking at the exact title, but Where Does the Money Go? Or something to that effect. So that's one of the choices you have, and I think that would be a great one for all of us to be part of, but don't all go there. But you get the point. Read the chapter and check out the charts, and let's bring these conversations back into our campus. I know that Helu will be doing more on teaching and sharing models for critical budget analysis, which I think is a skill that we need to be developing, if not individually, then collectively, because it's one thing to be able to just say we need more and we deserve to get what we need to teach, which shouldn't be that hard to understand. But we also, I think, need to be able to refute in a close reading kind of way the claims of our administrators or the administrators, whether it's at the bargaining table or in front of the board of trustees or in the pages of the local newspapers. A second point I want to make, besides that useful chapter, I was really impressed by the chapters of Maria and Claire and I'll just say one thing about each of them. Maria, I thought your essay was really an exemplary work of kind of all-sided collective reflection on kind of a period of praxis, if you will, the theory and praxis, focusing on like a simple little thing that probably most of us here have used or heard, right? The slogan, faculty working conditions are student learning conditions. And I think you give us really a great example of what activist close reading can look like, in the sense, and you both looking at the strengths of that slogan, like the context out of which it emerged, the uses of it, but also some of the limits of it, right? Pointing out the way in which, raising questions, not throwing away the slogan, but saying, like, is it possible by accenting the uniqueness of faculty working conditions, we might not have, that slogan wasn't doing the work of staff faculty solidarity that we need to be building. And you have some other more kind of nuanced points in that piece. I think it's really, really useful. And it both is good at highlighting the strengths of that slogan and its limitations, but in a practical sense of informing it, not to say like, oh, we need a purer slogan, right? But like to say, like, how do we work with the tools we have in light of the experience we've had so that we improve the tools, but also improve how we use the tools. And I just think it's exemplary that way. And it's a kind of activist close reading I think we should be doing in our own unions and in a regular, as in print as well as in person. I'll also say, Claire, Raymond, and John Holmes, I trust you've been timing me as well here. Okay, thank you, because I'm not timing myself. Maria, on to Claire. Claire, I think I told this to you privately when we spoke before today, but I just think your use of not only the term social dirt, which I think has been spoken to already, but also the notion of social death is very powerful and insightful. You draw from the work of Orlando Patterson, who's known as one of the leading global historians of slavery. And you make it very clear you're not drawing a direct analogy or identity between adjunctum and chattel slavery, racialized slavery, but you zero in on his concept of social death, which he is not just reducible to slavery. And you talk about how the notion of the non-nay, right? I think is maybe, I don't know if that comes from like a Creole kind of like, right? The notion of like the idea that adjuncts or as you said, you're a permanent visitor. You've been a permanent visitor, right? This idea that the adjunct faculty or the non-tenure track faculty member is kind of never really symbolically born, doesn't really have parents in the academy, in a sense, doesn't have the kind of, regardless, even if they're paid a decent livable salary, which maybe often is not the case, are not fully incorporated symbolically into the kind of order of higher ed, and also not able to kind of give birth to children, right, that are recognized by the system. And for me, as a kind of research active, full-time non-tenure track faculty member, I feel like that was hit home very powerfully, that like adjuncts and even the most kind of relatively well-off non-tenure track folks are kind of orphans in the academy, and that considering the amount of symbolic investment that many of us make to get these degrees and to go into these professions, that is not an insignificant point. And I think, I don't know, I don't really have a great practical answer, to like what this means for how we might look forward, but I do think we need to kind of think about each other, and we think about the precarity and the psychological impacts of this. We need to kind of build family, like we need to like I don't want to get too like sentimental about it, and I don't mean family in some narrow sense, but like what does it mean to think about each other as like orphans? You know what I mean? Like that we have been symbolically kind of abandoned by what we thought was going to be our parents. And I think that's an important point. And I mean, it may resonate more for some than others, but I thought that was really brilliant. And I just wanted to say that out loud to the group beyond just on a sidebar. The final thing I think I'll say, because I'm assuming my time is running, the sense of time always flies when I'm speaking, for me anyway, I hope for you. This book makes it very clear, a couple of points, that we are dealing with a multi-tier system. I know sometimes shorthand is that we talk about a two-tier system, and there may be places and institutions where that does describe the reality. But as Eric makes very clear in the opening of this book, we're dealing with very much a multi-tier system. And I had the numbers. He has the numbers broken down in one of the opening pages here, right, where he talks about, basically we're dealing with, as of the numbers he's working with, 26% of faculty being tenured at this point, 10% being on tenure track but not yet tenured, 43% being part-time, aka adjunct lecturers, and 20% being full-time NTT, and then that's not counting the graduate employees. If you factor them in, then they're 13% of the total as well. Right, so we're really dealing with a multi-tier system, and we need to kind of organize with that in mind, I think, in light of Claire's question about who really benefits and who, in fact, only appears to benefit because they're getting screwed over less than others. That is to say, make a distinction between relative privilege and actual benefit from the system. That said, I do think that it's very important that we not neglect the particular needs of part-timers, the most contingent and most precarious in our ranks, particularly those at places like community colleges, where there may be, in fact, some lived truth of the two-tier reality where you have 70, 80% or more of folks laboring under conditions of adjunct status, and only a very small percentage who have access to a full-time, let alone a tenure track position. And I do think this volume gives voice to that, but I think there's a need to give more voice to that perspective. And I do want to point out that Helu will be hosting an event on the 23rd of March that is not this, but next Saturday, specifically focused on strategies for struggle at community colleges. And it would be great if many of you could come to that. I'll put the links in the chat once I'm done talking here. So I guess what I'm left with is like a Helu organizer. I mean, this book really, I think, gives us tools and of various sorts to build. What we need is a united front movement that is as wide and, kind of inclusive as possible, not only of faculty, but staff and students and communities we serve, but that also deliberately works to raise up the most precarious and exploited within the context of that united front. Right? And I think there's a lot of people out there that feel like you can't do both. You can't have both inclusivity and really be focusing on the most precarious and exploited. You can only do one or the other. I think we need to do both. And the question I wanted to kind of, and I think that includes the vast majority of even tenure track or tenured faculty, although there may be exceptions, some true exploiters that are out there that are basically, literally profiting from the labor, but I think that's a small minority. And the question I wanted to ask now, which I'm not going to put you through the time of it, because I think my time is about out now, and I want you all to get in your breakout room so you can do the talking for yourselves and the listening and the note-taking. But I did want to ask this question, which I've been thinking about writing about, and that is to say, I mean, it's very easy to establish, although we must still speak of it, the things that non-tenure track and contingent part-time faculty and adjuncts lose as a result of the system, the things we lose, the things that harm us as a result of the system. But I think we also need to develop our arguments and understanding of what even the tenure track, even the relatively privileged, lose as a result of this system. And one thing they lose is they lose all of us, or many of us, as colleagues, as fully contributing members of departments and at least above, at least not in the underground sense of the word, above ground colleagues, scholars, and the kind of contributors and editors that have put this brilliant book together, the kind of collective intelligence that is manifest in this volume is kind of can stand in as a kind of synecdoche for the brilliance that's all too often driven underground if it's not burned out completely by this system. And I think we need to keep in mind, we're not just fighting for our own particular needs, we're fighting for the greater good of this system and any good the system could do for this world, the common good notion of higher ed that Helena has spoken to so powerfully a moment ago. So I just want to leave it with that. I think, and I guess I want us to kind of sit with this question. What has this system cost us? How has it harmed us, depending on the position in which we sit? But also how, by hurting us, is it also hurting others? This is about us, but it's also about more than us. And I hope y'all can take that bit of, passion in your own way into the breakout rooms, which we're now going to start. You're going to have 25 minutes with a breakout room of your choice. These breakout rooms are open already. If you go to your breakout room tab, you should be able to select a room. That for me, I had to click on the more button in the bottom right to make the breakout room tab come up. There are 7 rooms, and you should be able to choose your own room. If you need some help, you can speak up, and we'll try to direct you. But there are 7 rooms. Join one, and please report back. All right, welcome back. I trust y'all had a very generative and engaging breakout room session. We have just a few minutes left before our end time. We did start 5 minutes late, so we can go till 9:05, and maybe if folks are welcome to stay a little bit longer. But what I think we had 7 breakout groups, and if we could maybe hear from each group for just a minute or two, in addition to whatever you've put in the chat, I should say in the Google Doc, which I will share once again here for those who might not have seen it the first time. I don't know that I shared it right before we went into breakout rooms, but feel free to use that now or after the meeting. But perhaps we could go around and hear the highlights from the group. So if you could if you could raise your hand or signify you'd like to speak and tell us what your group topic was, and give us just maybe a key takeaway or two from what you discussed, particularly if there's any forward-looking proposals or questions that you think the group should kind of kick forward for future discussion. So who would like to go first? I see John Holmes.
Well, John, should I go over the notes? You're
Okay.
muted, John.
This is the group on breakout. I'm sorry, this is the group on cutbacks. Is that right?
Yeah, John is muted. I'm the one who took notes. I could just read through the
Okay,
notes.
Rick, why don't you give us a few takeaways from
Okay, and again, I may have mischaracterized what people wrote. So this is the group on fighting the cutbacks, and as was pointed out very early, the part-timers are usually the first to be cut, and how can that be countered? You know, there's the question of, do you organize for a strike, or do you focus on lobbying politicians to get, more money for the college? And this mixed, maybe people would say you should do both. Someone pointed out, and I think this is true from what I've experienced, many schools have gone from models of growth to models of retrenchment or models of austerity. And they bring in consultants who come up with plans to make cuts and that divide apart departments and cause other kinds of problems of that sort. Here in California, you could say to a certain extent the same is true in New York, is that the problem of the Democrats are not adequately funding public education. And we need to be able to fight for more funding. And another concern was how the arts and letters departments are more likely to be cut than the professional schools, depending on where you're at. Another suggestion is to look at the college's budget and see how money is being spent. You may not, though someone pointed out, you may not be able to impact it much, but there's a lot of shenanigans with budgeting that many of us have experienced. There's also the concern of, the leadership of unions who don't want to do anything about ending the two-tier system, that there's problems with the transfer system in California to CSUs that could end in eliminating a lot of what's called lifetime learning classes being eliminated. So those are among the problems. And again, many people will say that at their campuses, there can be a lot of demoralization. So what kind of action be taken? Whether or not you want to go on strike, you should prepare for strike, because that's going to at least send a message to the administration. But to prepare for a strike, you really need to build unity among members, and not only just among faculty, but you also want to include staff, students, and the community. And in New York, because they have the anti-strike law, person who teaches in New York said you have to be prepared to get arrested and maybe even target people like the governor with actions where you can get arrested. Others will say, well, there's many states that don't allow strikes, and yet that can, if you get a lot of unity, that's not going to be a problem if you do go on strike. Then the last thing was questions for further discussion. So, one question is, how can the animosity between full-timers and part-timers be reduced or eliminated? And how can we get proper funding for education? So sorry if this is random, a lot of different things, but I quickly take notes.
Thank you, Rick. I'm sure a lot of important stuff there, and a lot that we will be dealing with in our March 23rd event on strategies for struggle at the community college, including we'll have a couple speakers who have taken adjuncts out on strike, as well as who are building strike capacity and strike schools as we speak. Let's move on to the next group, which is organizing reading groups. Actually, do we have a report from Eric and Claire, or maybe something they want to tell us about the reading group resources that are available?
Well, we can be quick on this one.
Okay.
So we do encourage people to make use of the reading guide, and I'll put that in the chat again, the reading discussion guide, and to make use of that, particularly for developing workplace-based or union-based discussion groups, hopefully using the book as a tool, and we're pleased if it can be of use in that way. So I'll put that in the chat again.
Eric and Claire, I don't know if either of you would be willing, but I think it would be great if you and your contributors to the book would create a speakers bureau. If people wanted to have an anchor speaker to come to talk to their union forum, like based on maybe a chapter, have, you know, a reading group. It might be great to be able to put some faces in some Zooms, if not in person, you know, to maybe incentivize some of those little local reading groups as well. I don't know, just a thought. But
And I think we would be very happy to do that. We did recently have one with Temple University and the union there, and just get in touch with us. We'd be very happy to do that. Claire, did you have something on that too?
No, I was just going to say, feel free to reach out to either of us, and we'll help in any way we can.
and there is a $9 way to get the book as well, right? So I don't know if you want to share that chat, that link again in the chat for those who might not have the book yet, but and there's some discounts as well. I think you've shared it for those who don't have it yet. I see
the $9 is on the Evil Empire. It's for a Kindle version, but there is a discount which I shared earlier that you can get through the press as well.
Thank you. Maybe if you could share it again for those who didn't get it at the time, but now want to, that would be great. Looks like we have Daniel Bayer in the group on higher ed and society, right, Daniel?
Yeah, contingency in the larger community or society. Yeah, a pretty lively discussion. I tried to keep up with it, but some of our key points was that Pell Grants and income drive the operation of higher ed and leading to the administration misleading both students and the educators in the name of increasing enrollment and profit with little emphasis on pedagogy. The result is a proletarization of academia, or the view as educators is simply a means to an end. But the academy is a social structure, and these forces are creating a new faculty and a new academy with these changes. And to control this development, we have to overcome the barriers of labor division to enhance our power to create these new structures. In terms of proposals for actions, we talked about the message to a larger community, and that would be the education must be run as a public service and not a business that was not to wind up as being run by an elite solely for profit. We have to have a real critique of the big picture and not just come across as merely disgruntled over our own conditions. We have to look for allies in the entire higher ed movement, including the students and, you know, the people who foot the bill, like parents and such. So it's kind of, because what's happening to us affects the larger community, we need to actually, you know, sort of mobilize ourselves, as well as making sure our message gets out to that larger community about the effects that it's having on them as well.
Thank you, Daniel. That's really great stuff. I think it would be really great to have a conversation about how to reach parents, what students and parents, and that would be an issue. That could be an event in itself. Maybe we invite some parents to that discussion. Maybe some of us are higher ed parents here, even as we share. Moving on, in light of time, we have overcoming barriers to part-time / non-tenure track and full-time tenure track solidarity. I believe we had co-facilitators of this. We had Mike Budd, as well as Holly Clark. Mike and Holly, one of you want to share?
Yeah, I think Holly was taking notes. Holly?
Mike, David was taking notes.
Oh, David was taking notes. I'm sorry.
Okay, real quickly. What we came up with is that the problem is we were predominantly community college faculty. The problem is in community college is systemic, and that has just continued. It's going to take a major change. This is not a superficial problem. And those who are benefiting from the inequity and the lack of fairness in the community college system are the people who are in charge of the people of the unions that are supposed to be fixing it. So there's sort of a conflict of interest. If you're benefiting from a situation, why would you change it? The question of tenure. If tenure is job security and free speech, all faculty deserve that. So let's find a solution where tenure is granted to faculty and not just the brass ring that a few people at the top receive and everyone else is left in the cold. We're looking at the solution for all of our problems in community colleges, and also in 4 years would be looking at the one-tier model and just saying, look, the system as it is right now doesn't work because these multiple tiers are embedded with unfairness. So if we look at a one-tier solution at community colleges and also at four-year institutions where there are prime examples of tiered inequity between lecturers. While we have made some progress in salary and job security and benefits, especially in California, where we have 75 different districts and have to negotiate everything individually, it's all piecemeal. And if salaries go up, benefits go down. If something is good, something gets worse. So we need to fix the entire system. And that was our conclusion. Looking forward, let's look at the one-tier solution to fix this mess. There you are.
Thank you, David. And I do want to bookend that by saying that community college struggles of contingent faculty will be the centerpiece of the March 23rd event. That's not this, but next Saturday. Starts at 2 p.m. Eastern. And we have a great lineup of speakers, including two speakers that are going to be talking about the struggle to create a one-tier system. One who actually was involved in creating a one-tier system at Vancouver Community College north of the border, and another who's involved in the one, I may get the title wrong, but essentially the one-tier or one faculty task force efforts out in the California community colleges. So we'll also, that's the same event that will also feature Diana Valera, who is the president of the, now my understanding is the longest ever adjunct strike in US labor history, which recently finished up at Columbia College of Chicago. So not a community college, but we'll be learning from the adjunct strike experience. So please do put that on your calendar. I just put a registration link in the chat box for that. I know Tracy already shared the new flyer. Thank you, Tracy. So let's continue on the community college front soon. Okay. Looking at the list here, we have the group that I was a member of, Building Alliances with Students. That was with two other great colleagues. We had Rose and Maria. Maria or Rose, do you want to share a highlight or two from our discussion of our wide-ranging discussion around student-faculty alliance, or the lack of it?
Well, one thing we talked about was using our classrooms as an organizing place, especially my situation is community college, and it's a place where we actually develop relationships with our students and can teach them about labor law. That was a big part of our conversation. And we noted some problems with bringing students into organizing, such as they graduate. Community college students are, they get older, they go away. And community college students have a lot of other things going on in their lives. And then that brought us to the need for looking at stability in that, like a place to meet, a way to fund it, that kind of thing. It was fast.
Yeah, and just adding to that, I know that one point we also added is that increasingly many students are actually also employees at the university or at the campus. And a lot of them are quite disgruntled and not happy with the way they're being treated. I know that firsthand at UMass Boston, and I've been hearing about efforts of students to organize as workers. So I do think that we as HELU and we, wherever we find ourselves, need to be mindful of students, not only as someone who might support labor struggles of someone else, but who are engaged in labor struggles themselves already on and off campus. But I do think that gives us one potential on-campus anchor if we could, develop and support undergraduate student employee organizations. That would be, I don't know, I think a very valuable thing for faculty and staff organizing on campus as well. The other thing I want to say is the Rutgers campus. I don't know if we have folks here tonight from Rutgers, but I know they seem to have done an exemplary job building, and I say they, I mean the unions on campus, in supporting the development of undergraduate organizing over time. And that has involved putting actual resources from the unions in the hands of undergraduate student organizers, not just to do turnout for union stuff, but to organize as semi-autonomous student organizing funded by the unions to build trust and community among organizations over time. And I think it's something for our national unions as well as our locals to be thinking about how we can put some material support for our often cash and time-strapped students to actually semi-professionalize this work in a sustainable way, instead of assuming we can always run on voluntarism when it comes to like student solidarity. I think we need to, be serious about this, and I hope we can do a future event specifically on this. And I'll stop there. I think we have a couple more groups left. We have The question everyone wants to know, where does the surplus money go? With Sudo, and I think we still have a couple folks from that group on here, and then we'll move on to academic freedom with Helena and company.
Yeah, I'll move quickly here because I was the one person taking notes, but I am going to call on Susanna because I think she's still on the call. When we hit very quickly on one component of the study that Stephen and I did, and that is that it is essentially a false argument that public institutions must depend upon contingent hiring to make ends meet due to the withdrawal of public support of higher ed. Our study shows definitively that private institutions are relying just as heavily on contingent hiring as publics are, which really blows a hole in the entire argument that that's what this is about. And so then I'm gonna ask Susanna if she would be willing just to speak to what her sort of dismay was in kind of hitting upon that, and when we got to that point, because she asked if it isn't about if contingency isn't about saving money, what is it about? So Susanna, do you mind speaking into that?
Sure. I guess for a little context, I spent a lot of time recently talking to people not from the US about labor conditions in the US and trying to explain what's going on and why things happen the way they do, which great questions. I don't know either. Right. My dismay was basically this. I generally, when I tell people about adjunctification in US higher education, which gets complicated because the fact that we're essentially for-profit anyway, as opposed to government funded as a public good, is bizarre. But starting there, I describe it as being a result of the corporatization of higher education over the past 10 or 15 years. What dismayed me, though, was that if it's not actually about saving money at all costs, if it's not actually about saving money, then the implication is that it was actually about disempowering faculty the whole time. And on the one hand, one tries to be very cautious about conspiracy theories. And on the other hand, there's been a 50-year fundamentalist conservative anti-woke, as is, that's a new term, movement in this country, which is not a conspiracy because it's right out there. And it's making, I haven't read the book. So one of the things I said is I have to go read the book, I think now, because I'm really starting to wonder about what that whole corporatization of higher education was about, and whether it implies that there may have been political motivations behind it. Maybe all of you knew that the whole time, but I hadn't. I thought it was just about late stage capitalism and saving money. Was that what you had in mind, Sue?
Yes, thank you so much, Susanna. And I think, one of the things that we hit upon too was just that the way that this, the disempowerment really, hits the humanists first, and reflects the kind of patriarchal nature of the situation. And Susanna pointed this out as well. The departments that are most heavily hit, most immediately hit, are those departments that are most commonly employ women and people of color. And the question then becomes, how is patriarchy then working as a force that we must contend with, that is revealed by the specious nature of the economic argument. So we'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sue, and I really do hope we can hear more from you and I hope everyone will read the chapter you and Stephen did on this very important issue. I think Helu will be doing more on kind of breaking down the finances, and I think we need to do more of this critical budgetary kind of education. I think, and I hope that you can really be a part of that conversation. I mean, I know that your work will. All right, I think we have one more group, and then we can wrap up formally for the evening. Group number 6, Contingency and Academic Freedom. Helena, Ann, and Roger were in that group.
Hi there. It was a small group, which I think that's worth noting. because I think every single one of us has the experience of butting up against the limits of academic freedom when you try to teach or do research or speak in the public sphere, or for heaven's sakes, get involved in governance. I think the bottom line for our group was one participant said, I can't do my job. You know, what is going on here? The way things are set up means that I can't do my job. And others spoke about a loss of identity, about treading water, about not being sure whether they were going to be able to teach their class or not. These were people who were pretty union savvy. I mean, one of them was from a union that has been very active and has what people consider a pretty good contract. Another is from a union that's kind of passive and not very trustworthy, but it actually does exist. And then the third person is engaged in mobilizing and having one-on-one conversations. So these were all people who had a good grasp of what the lack of academic freedom meant, both organizationally and in terms of their personal lives. And I hope we hear from all of them. I'm, as chair of the media committee, I want to point out that I'll bet that there are people in all of these breakout groups that have something that you could write and that you could send in to be on, published on our newsletter or in our blog. Stuff needs to be short, and just send it in to any one of us here from HALU or to Tracy.
Thank you, Helena. Helena, maybe you could put your email in the chat box, or Tracy, I know, has put some contact info in there, and I will do the same in a moment. But all right, well, that I think wraps up our formal agenda. I just want to point out that this is a product of a kind of co-sponsor group that worked together for these two events. We will have YouTube videos of both events up, which we encourage you to share with colleagues. Although we don't have any more events planned as part of this series, HALU's Contingency Task Force will be presenting an event, not this, but next Saturday, March 23rd, on strategies for the struggles at community colleges. We'll be having we have a coast-to-coast panel, even a north of the border contributor from Vancouver, as mentioned earlier. And we'll have, I think, a very good discussion of both the conditions, the struggles, but also specifically focused on strategies for making not just incremental, but qualitative leaps forward in the organizing and the transformation of these unjust and absurd, unequal conditions within our institutions. I just want to thank you all for being here. Please, if you'd like to get involved in the Contingency Task Force, not only for the event on the 23rd, but more broadly, you could reach out to me or to HALU directly. I just put my email in the chat box as jgramsey@gmail.com. Reach out to me or any of the other self-identified HALU folks you'd like to plug in. I really love Helena's idea of converting some of these thoughts into writing, whether for short blurbs for the newsletter or perhaps the next book that needs to be produced on this topic. Although this book has given us a ton to think about and to work on, there's always more stories to be told and more lessons to be learned. So I trust that y'all will be continuing to work on these things and summing up the struggles. And we will make sure to share a kind of synthesis of the breakout room notes with this group. We're not joking about trying to develop our collective insight through these process. We're not just talking into a void. So we will compile all the breakout lessons we have and put them in a form we can send to all those who contributed and participated in these discussions. So if you have other things to add to your group's breakout session in the Google Doc, please do that. We will be funneling it into this collective process as HALU is planning its first in-person convention for this spring or this summer. So we hope you're all involved in that one way or the other. Thank you all for being here. And thanks again to Eric and Claire and all the contributors for their great work. We can perhaps stop the recording, but